Hello viewers, welcome to Once Upon a Time once again. Today's podcast is going to be the first of its kind as regards the topic. It's the first academic oriented podcast that I'm having, and today's guest is a young research scholar. I do not know this person that well. I had only heard about her a couple of years back from one of my PG students. Well, he came up to me and he said, ma'am, do you know this person from this college? And I said, no. You remind me of her. And I felt more curious to know who this person was. And then as I took early retirement and stepped out of college, when I went back to college for a few official things to be done, I met her. And she is in the same college that I was working in. And now my students, PG students, text me sometimes saying, ma'am, when we see her, we're reminded of you. So there must be something really common between the two of us, except that she is a PhD and I'm not a PhD. And so the PhD topic that she has done and worked on has fascinated me, and that's the reason why I've invited her here today to this podcast. So we are talking about Dr. Rochelle Fernandes. Rochelle, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you so much.
Tell us something about yourself, your schooling, your present occupation.
So, like you already said, I'm currently at Government College Sankeli. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English, and interestingly, I also sit at your desk. Okay. Prior to this, I was at Goa University, and then before that at Dempe College of Arts and Science. I have done my PhD at BITS Pilani KK Birla Goa campus.
Lovely.
And I was in Bangalore for 2 years where I pursued an MA in English.
All right.
And before that, I was at St. Xavier's College, Mapsa.
Lovely, yeah. That's an interesting journey. So what made you take up teaching?
I think it was my love for reading that compelled me to choose literature.
Literature, okay.
Did I know I was going to become a teacher? I don't know. I don't think that was the plan. I really don't know. But something along the way with all my discussions that happened during my MA lectures and the fact that I realized that literature has this ability to completely change the way you think about a situation or an event, it was something that absolutely fascinated me. And this is something that I wanted to continue doing, the discussions, I mean. And so that's how I think I got into teaching, and I absolutely love it.
Lovely. Good. And I think, I guess and I believe you're a good teacher. You're doing
I
well.
hope so.
You're doing well at that. So tell us more about your PhD.
So I worked on the Poskem, okay, and it was this book actually by Wendell Rodrigues that got me thinking about the Poskem. And a lot of people ask me, what about the Poskem did I actually work on? Because what is there to work on, right? I mean, there's no information about them. There's no historical evidence or something of their existence. And that's exactly what compelled me to pursue this topic, because there was no information about them. So it actually started at my friend's 17th birthday party. I was invited to a house, and our parents are family friends. So her mom and dad were really excited to meet me, and we started talking, and oddly enough, they started showing me a family photograph. And this was a photograph that was put onto a wall. Okay, so they took it off the wall and they started pointing out at siblings. This is my brother, and this is my older brother and younger sister, and all those kind of things. And then finally, they pointed to a woman in. And I won't forget this. She was sitting on the extreme right in a corner, and they said this was our Poskem. And the term was extremely foreign to me. I mean, I know I am a native Konkani speaker, but this term was extremely foreign to me. And so I think my facial expressions were pretty evident at that point. So my friend's mother asked me, you don't know what a Poskem is? So I said, no, I don't. And she said, I really wanted a sister, so my mummy brought this girl home. And that was it, okay? And then the conversation went on to another topic and so on. I got home and I asked my dad, what does this term Poskem mean? And he obviously knew about their Poskem, and he said, it just means adopted. They've adopted this girl. And that was that. And it felt odd because if the child was adopted, she could have just said that we had adopted this child, but she didn't, right? She said that I wanted a sister, and so my mummy brought this girl home. And within my parents' friend circle, a lot of their friends have adopted children, and we've known them as adopted children. So I couldn't understand, where this terminology, I mean, why didn't she use the same terminology? And that's it. Like, I didn't think much about it. I was around 17, 18 years old. Fast forward to my master's. I think this was in 2019. A friend of mine, his name is Shoaib, he posts these blogs about books that he's read. And I used to always follow him, and I used to find it very interesting because he's a doctor. Okay. And he posted a picture of Wendell Rodricks's novel, and of course a little blurb and things like that. And the minute I saw this term post-care, that it kind of triggered this memory, this very same anecdote. And I got talking to him about it. So when I did a quick Google search, there was nothing. The only thing that came up, and even today, if you Google search post-care, just the term post-care, it will all be about Wendell Rodricks, his interviews about the book, and I think there's like around 2 other articles, one in Selma Carvalho's journal and another by Leopoldo da Rocha, and that's it. There's complete silence. And so I thought, okay, there's not much of information about Goa-related things like this on the internet anyway, so maybe I'm just looking in the wrong place. But that's the thing, no matter how much I looked, there was barely anything that was written about them. And that is what kind of got me thinking about these individuals. Who are they? What do they mean? Where can I find them? Do they still exist? And I think I started looking at the post-care as individuals who have disappeared. And that's exactly what led me to
extinct. This reminds me of the road not taken. So you've taken the road that is less traveled by, and probably that has made all the difference.
Definitely.
So for the sake of our viewers or listeners who are out of Goa, could you please explain that term post-care, and if there are connotations attached to it?
Right.
So they would not know,
So the term post-care actually refers to informally adopted children who were taken in during the colonial rule, and they were taken in by elite Goan Catholic households. Now I say elite because you had to have a certain kind of financial standing to be able to just randomly take in another child and look after that child. In terms of connotations, I would say this term, if you look at it derivatively, it means to rear or to feed, and it was generally used to refer to cattle. Right? So they would use the word posunk. It was derived from the word posunk, which means to take in and look after. And that's exactly how this term came about. And then the fact that it was used to refer to children is it makes you feel a little uneasy. Right? So these children were taken in by these elite Goan Catholic households, and some of them were treated extremely well. They were treated on par with the biological members of the family. But this seems to be a minority, right? From the data I've collected, it appears that most of them were taken in and were denied rights that were given to the biological members of the family, like the right to education, right to marriage, right to inheritance, and they were kind of kept in the household to look after the elderly members of the family, right? So when they were brought in, they were looked after by the family because they were children, and as they grew older, they took on caregiving roles.
So it almost borders on some sort of a slavery.
It does, and actually that's basically what my thesis is about. I'm kind of reframing this meaning of the term post-care, and I'm using it, I'm now telling people that I think we need to extend the usage of the word slavery because it should include different forms of enslavement. And families in South Asia have been known for this kind of, bondage and slavery. So I think it was very important to redefine what this term means and stop looking at them as informally adopted children and to start looking at them as a species of slavery. So that's essentially what my thesis does, that's the theoretical part of it.
Wendell Rodrick's book, Poskem, has this sense of affection. It also has this stigma attached to it. So how does this duality exist in day-to-day life?
But that's exactly how it was in real life also. There was affection towards them. They were considered to be important members of the family, but not on par with the biological members. That was the only difference. So it's not like they were all completely ill-treated and things like that. Yes, many of them were physically and sexually abused. There's no doubt about that. But many of them were considered to be very important members of the family. In fact, some oral narratives that I've collected have even gone on to say that these Poskem were our older aunts. They were the elder aunts in the family, but they were the unmarried members. They remained in the house when everyone else left. And that is what I felt was extremely unfair. And that's something that people should talk about. So while everyone talks about how charitable this institution was, there is another side to it that was exploitative. And we have to acknowledge this, which is something that our society finds difficult to do. They cannot digest the fact that I am calling them slaves. Because they say they weren't, they were members of our family. But if they were members of their family, they wouldn't eat in the kitchen. They wouldn't have to do chores around the house that the other children have to do. They wouldn't remain unmarried or uneducated or without an inheritance or without wages. They were basically an unpaid form of labor. And this unpaid form of labor was masked by religious charity, which is what makes it so problematic.
So was there any kind of an grievance addressal for them?
So this was an informal practice, so there's no established record. And the fact that they were informally adopted means there was no law that could protect them.
Okay, so informal adoption.
Yes, it was
there
informal
are no
adoption.
legal,
For Catholics, absolutely not. There was no formal adoption at the time. Hindus could adopt. Okay, they had a different law that allowed them to adopt, but Catholics were not included in this law because this was a customary law that the Portuguese then codified when they came to Goa. But because it was a Hindu law, non-Hindus, it was not accessible to them.
Okay. So Rochelle, what were the reasons for families, these affluent families, to adopt such Poskem children, and were they gender-specific adoptions?
Okay, so if you look around Goa, you'll see a lot of opulent houses, these palatial homes, and they required additional hands to look after these homes. And obviously, it was going to be extremely expensive to pay, right? I mean, you would require not just one or two, you'd require at least 10. And my thinking is that when slavery was abolished, they had to somehow acquire labor that they could afford, right? It was a long-term thing.
Afford and look decent enough.
Exactly, because slavery was abolished and nobody wanted to be called an enslaver or anything of that sort. So in order to protect their family name and maybe even come across as benevolent, right, they would adopt these children, and what happened behind closed doors happened behind closed doors. So to the whole world, these families were considered to be extremely benevolent, charitable, pious even. Like, it was so amazing of them to take in these destitute children and give them a home, shelter, food.
Like the Good Samaritans.
Like the Good Samaritans. But finally, what happened is just this.
So were they gender-specific adoptions, like only girls or only boys?
So no,
it was equal.
It was not equal. Yes, there were boys and girls who were adopted. They were put in different positions in the household, but it appears that there were more number of girls who were adopted. And I also think it has a lot to do with the fact that it was domestic service. So women have always historically, occupied the domestic space. So it was girls who were adopted more often than not. And also, it was not just adoption from like orphanages or these holy homes or anything of that sort. There's another side to it, and that is a lot of the male members in the household would have these affairs.
So illegitimate.
And so the children would be illegitimate. And in order to save face, in order to avoid scandals, these children were adopted into the household. So a lot of times you would hear stories of these random children who were brought in, and the stories would be that the priest sent them, or like a poor woman came and gave their child to us, and that kind of thing. But
eventually you would know that the blood is here.
Absolutely.
So if there were no formal adoptions then, so there would not have been records, right?
There would not have been adoption records.
But
there were baptism records.
Oh.
Yeah. So they were baptized. Many of them were
So
baptized.
if one wants to trace a lineage,
One good place is your church offices. How much access you have to church offices, I don't know, because priests that I've spoken to in the past have not been willing to. I mean, and naturally,
obvious,
nobody wants to
nobody
divulge
wants
this kind
to,
of information because it's someone's identity that we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
But there was this one family who did give me a baptism certificate. Of course, I had to blacken out almost all the details that would identify the family, and naturally so. But there were very interesting remarks on the baptism certificate. For instance, when it came to father's name, unknown father. And in the remarks column, it was written that all the information that is unknown is information withheld. You know, so there was no rule that the father's name had to be
there.
revealed. Yeah. The mother's name, yes, because she was giving birth, but the father's name, no.
In a Goa that was shifting from, the older Goa to the Goa of the 1960s, how were these Poskem kids or children treated from the Portuguese lens, from the Catholic lens, and from the Goan Hindu lens?
So I think post-liberation, when Goa merged with India, adoption laws came into place, right? And then adoptions were formal, as it is today. The Poskem that were already within these families remained in the families. There's nothing that anyone could do about them. The Portuguese, I haven't really explored how the Portuguese may have viewed this practice, because one thing that I did find in my study was that there were different kinds of wardship that existed in different Portuguese colonies.
Okay.
Right? So in Goa it was called Poskem, but in other Portuguese colonies like Brazil and Mozambique, they had different names for similar practices. And again, very less records, right? Unless it was institutionalized. Like in Mozambique, it was institutionalized, but in Brazil, for instance, it wasn't. So again, very less records, we have to rely on fiction. But in terms of shifting social perceptions, that was what was very important. Because the minute people started recognizing that this is wrong, the practice died down. Are there any Poskem today? Yes. They still are alive, and this is probably the last generation, amongst us. Are they treated well? Not entirely, at least not the individuals that I have spoken to. But can anything be done? I doubt. Because I came across a court case in my study, and there the judge very clearly said that there were different reasons that people adopted children during the Portuguese rule, and one was as servants. So they were adopted, but adopted for servitude, not as children to cherish. And if a judge was saying something like that, and obviously he knew what the practice was like, we know that for them to get any sort of restorative justice would be very, very difficult. There are cases of Poskem and their families still fighting for inheritance rights, but I don't see that working out very well.
Well, when the motive of, adopting them for doing household chores or making them servants also implies that they would not give them a share of their property or, get them, to be well off in life as far as education, qualification, or even settling in marriage, I'm sure. This must be there. So what happens to these girls grow up to be unmarried spinsters and then become aunts when they are old age? Did that come as part of your study, knowing what their situation is as they grow old?
So some of them actually ran away. They eloped or just escaped the household. Some of them, like I said, were treated well. So they were educated and married off, mostly to other adopted children. Okay. Some of them, like you said, did remain in the household till the end, and still others were sent off to old age homes. So it honestly, their entire lives just depended on the family that adopted them. So if the family that adopted them were actually benevolent, they would be well taken care of. But it just depended on their luck, I guess, and the family that adopted them.
Very sad story, sad part of this whole. What about the other texts that you have studied for?
Right. So, of course, Poskem, Goans in the Shadows by Wendell Rodrigues is just one. I had around 13 stories that I looked at. Some of them were short stories. Two were written by Bertha Menezes Braganza in Tales from Goa. Tales from Goa, yes. And there she talks about how the Poskem were exploited and just the way they were treated. And
That's
what
again,
I found...
it's fiction.
It's fiction, yes.
Okay.
I think it's fiction, like how Wendell Rodrigues says in one of his interviews, his novel is actually fiction based on fact. So I think in some sense a lot of this that I was reading was fiction based on fact. But yeah, I did come across the character of the Poskem from Carmen de Souza's Angela's Goan Identity, and I also came across a very interesting Poskem character, and this was written by Vatsala Mendonça. It's called Shadow of the Palm Tree, and here she writes about an African Poskem. And this was the point that actually got me thinking about it as a species of slavery, because there were children brought from Mozambique and other parts of Africa into Goa, not as slaves but as adopted children. And they remained in Goa. In fact, I spoke to this individual. His name is Mervyn Maciel. He is currently in the UK, and he told me of his aunt and uncle who brought this African child from Lourenço Marques, Mozambique, and the child was then brought to live with his grandmother, and the grandmother looked after the child because she was a child, and as she grew older, she looked after the grandmother.
That's so sweet.
Right, okay, and but she was an African Poskem, right? So she was not educated or given wages or inheritance or anything of that sort, but interestingly, she did have a child. Right, so the locals, according to Maciel, accepted her as part of their community. But if you looked at her, and her name is Marie, she was African. You know, so she was very distinctly different. And when Vatsala Mendonça wrote of Claudinha, that is the African Poskem here, it made complete sense to me that this also came from reality.
Good. And you have one more text, I think.
Yes, I do also have Carmeline by Damodar Mauzo. Now, this is a little... a lot of people have not been completely... What is the word? They're not completely... convinced that Carmeline is a Poskem. Because she was taken in after her parents died, and she was taken in by her aunt and uncle. But what actually got me thinking of Carmeline as a Poskem was something that her aunt says about her when her uncle is trying to get her married. If I could just read apart from it.
Yes, I was going to ask you that.
Okay.
So I had a question there. After you finished your thesis and your 2 or 3 years or 4 years, how many years have passed? 5 years?
2 years.
2 years down the line. And I'm sure when you're in, these moments of self-reflection or, quiet, you must be thinking of some touching scene from there or some disturbing passage from these books.
Right.
So I wanted you to, in fact, read out for us.
I'll read that as well. But before this, there is this one part where I'll just talk about it perhaps. So Carmeline is to get married, and her aunt is very unhappy about this. Okay, and interestingly, Carmeline forms a romantic relationship with her cousin.
Okay.
And in order to avoid that relationship, her aunt gets him married off to someone else. And so Carmeline's obviously heartbroken, and the boy goes away and she's all alone at home, and so her uncle decides that it's time for her to get married as well. And so when he talks to his wife about this, she's unhappy, and she says that we have done our duty towards her. We've looked after her, we've taken her into our house, we've educated her, so on and so forth. Doesn't she have a duty towards us? And so her husband says, like, what kind of duty are you talking about? Well, she should stay and look after us in our old age. And he says that if you wanted her to stay and look after you in your old age, you should have made her your daughter-in-law. But this was very, very common, that the Poskem were not to get married. They were to function as the matriarch and patriarch's old age security. they were to look after them. That was the whole point of the Poskem, that when the family members, when the children would leave the home, someone would have to look after the parents. And that's when the Poskem came in. So they were actually very loved in some sense in the family. They were treated as confidants, okay, and in fact Carmel D'Souza also writes about how all the family recipes were passed on to the Poskem, because they would then, you know, uphold all of these things. And right, so in terms of a poignant moment in the text, I think this one I would take from Wendell Rodricks's Poskem Goins in the Shadows. And this is about the character Alda. Actually, I've always wondered why Rodricks calls it Poskem when he also writes about a male Poskem. And he says it in an interview. He says it's because Alda, one of the characters, one of the Poskem, her situation is actually the worst. So just to give you some context, Alda has formed a romantic relationship with one of the sons in the house. His name is Mauricio, and she gets pregnant. Okay, and obviously they haven't told anyone. But, and I'm going to read this part now. Mama Annie was the first person to notice that Alda's breasts had become more rounded, her hips a bit wider, and the bouts of morning sickness. She watched horrified as the cow saw used to draw the water entered Alda's body. She kept her children and husband away from this awful secret by making dresses that Alda floated in. Mama Annie saw the love and lust in her son Mauricio's eyes. She sent him away on a ship to live with her cousin in London. Alda was lost without her beloved Mauricio. She began to hate Mama Annie. Mama Annie's eyes turned from sky grey to devil red. Her fingers became claws of the leopard that roamed the village. Her neat hair bun became the wild tresses of the goddess in the nearby temple. All the while, this demon watched over Alda. When her waters broke, the demon took Alda to the kitchen and locked the doors. I want to say that this is a trigger warning moment. She put a kitchen napkin in her mouth so that the house would not awake with the screams of Alda's throes. When the infant opened its eyes and she saw the grey in them, Mama Annie filled a copper water basin with warm water. She placed the fair baby boy inside and pushed its little body into the warm water till she saw the trail of bubbles from the nostril disappear. Then she wrapped the child in a small sheet, dragged her feet to the far corner of the estate where she had dug a hole to plant a coconut tree she told Damu, the village gardener and fruit plucker, 2 weeks earlier. Throwing the bundle into the earth, Mama Annie shoveled the mud over as Alda watched through the trees, blood trailing down her thighs, the napkin long removed but no sound emerging from her stunned mind. She watched and shuddered in an overwhelming sorrow as her baby boy Solomon was covered in layers of red laterite Goan earth. That was the day Alda entered the wonderful world of insanity. They began to call her Piche Poskem. So, right, this was an eye-opener for me, because I think until this point I did not understand the extent of brutality that that this practice upheld. And a lot of people who have read this story don't agree with Rodricks's portrayal. They say that it's way more cruel than it actually was. But even if there was one case that was like this, I think it is worth acknowledging.
And if you see that his book is based on facts,
as he claims.
Yeah, as he claims. So again, the question is, if Wendell's book is based on things that have happened, and Damodar Mauzo's book is based on things that can happen, may happen. So how do you where do you see the merging point of these two books, and how do they go away from each other?
So the thing about Carmeline is that it's actually about, well, obviously the titular character Carmeline, and how she overcomes certain burdens in her life. Now this moment of adoption is just a very small moment in her life. It's not the entirety of it. It appears that Mauzo has been talking about how women were forced to migrate to the Gulf countries in order to support their families back home. And that's exactly what the story is about. It's about her migration and how she is extremely rich, but in terms of finances, but she has lost so much of her life when she comes back home, because she does not spend enough of time with her daughter. The fact that people gossip about her, the fact that there was this belief that these women who migrated abroad were all loose in that sense, and were sleeping around with their bosses. And in the story, Carmeline does do that. She does sleep with her boss, and this then affects the way her daughter was treated back in Goa, because people began to talk about her. Right? So I think that is what Mauser's focus was. These rumors, this gossiping about the Goan Aya, as Dale Menezes refers to it in one of his articles. But Poskem was essentially about one of these informally adopted children who was adopted into a Hindu household. She began to look for her siblings. She doesn't find them in the end. They cross paths, that's the beautiful part of it, but they don't know that they are, all siblings. They sit together at a table, but they don't know that they're all siblings. I think that's the beauty of it, And
but we, the readers, know.
We, the readers, know. We know that they're all connected. And one of the characters, and I think it's Alda, she notices that all of them have similar fingers or something like that. She notices these small things. But people call her Piche Poskem. So who's going to believe her, right? So I think this novel by Wendell Rodrigues is specifically about the Poskem. What I see in Damodar Mauser's Carmeline was just an instance of how a Poskem could have been treated in a household. And similarly in, say, Lambert Masquerade as a Sorrowing Lies My Land, the character of Lakshmi, she's essentially a Poskem. And when she falls in love with the son of the household, that is Antonio, the matriarch doesn't take it well. So she initially preaches Catholicism and love one another and respect and all of those things. But when it comes to her own son, she doesn't think Lakshmi is good enough. So so there are these similarities, in Carmeline and.
So there are more painful truths in Poskem.
Definitely, because I think it's very straightforward. It is calling the practice what it is, and in a lot of these narratives, none of them use the word Poskem. So I have to look at how they're treated and then say, oh, okay, this character is
That's
probably
the next question I wanted to
Poskem.
ask you is the narrator of these texts. Do we get to hear the Poskem directly, or do we get to know from the other characters?
No. So in some cases, you do get to hear from the Poskem directly, like in, of course, Roderick's novel, and also in one of the short stories by Bertha Menezes Braganza. But in most cases, no. In fact,
the third person.
Right. But in Shadow of the Palm Tree by Vatsala Mendonça, there is a chapter that is from Claudinha's point of view, the African Poskem's point of view. So that is also quite interesting. You get different points of view in the same narrative.
So in this whole process of data collection, I'm sure you must have come across direct first-hand narratives.
Right, I did. Yes.
Tell us more about that.
Like I said, I've spoken to two Poskem. One of them was not very comfortable, having me document her life, but the other was. And I wrote about her in quite a lot of detail, because it was not just her experience, but my experience with her. Getting to know her. And so hers is the only first-hand account that I've come across. But when I think of first-hand accounts, I'm also looking at family members in whose homes these Poskem resided, So I've also looked at their accounts as first-hand accounts, because they may not come directly from the Poskem themselves, but it is from individuals who are very close
to them
in terms of space, like emotional, and also like location, physical proximity to them, So I've also looked at it from that perspective. And these narratives have been quite telling, actually, because a lot of these individuals do not believe that what happened was exploitative, and I don't blame them. I don't blame them, because from their point of view, what their parents have done is extremely charitable. They have taken in an unrelated stranger and given that stranger a life that child would have probably not had anywhere else. In fact, there were a lot of cases where priests have said that, oh, thank God that these families took them in, because what would have happened to these children? Where would they have gone? But no one wants to account for the abuse that took place. And it's difficult for family members to accept that this kind of abuse could have happened. I mean, no one wants to believe that your parents have done this, right? I mean,
true.
It's natural.
Rochelle, how relevant is the study of Poskem today?
So, like I said earlier, while this practice has kind of ceased to exist, because obviously there are adoption laws to now protect children, there are still a few Poskem amongst us, and some of them actually have families as well. In such cases, a lot of their children have been fighting for inheritance rights. So if this study can somehow reframe the way we look at these individuals, not just as informally adopted children, but as victims and even survivors of this practice, and if it can help them, achieve even a little bit of what they are seeking to do, then I think it's extremely relevant.
Okay.
I think it's worth it.
Tell us about the significance of the roles of women in bringing up these Poskem children, especially mothers and aunts.
So, like I said, these children didn't go to school. So if they were tutored by the matriarchs at home. And they were, the kitchen was their domain. So they were taught all of these recipes and, family favorites by the matriarch. And a lot of these Poskem also had a lot of power in the home, in the sense that they were in charge of the other servants in the family, and this is actually something that comes out very, very well in Shyam Benegal's Trikal.
Okay.
So he has actually captured this Poskem practice beautifully, and in the film he talks about Milagrinia, who is not just the head of the servants, but she is also a confidant to the matriarch. So she plays a very important role. She almost acts as a living archive, because she knows secrets about the family that even the biological members don't know. So again, I think it depends on how the matriarchs feel about the Poskem. Now, in many cases, a lot of these Poskem, like I said, were abused in the household by the male members of the family. So in some cases, the matriarchs did not take to it well, and naturally so, right? You wouldn't want your husband or your son cohabiting with the Poskem. So in such cases, yes, they were in terrible positions to be in, because what could they have done? They had nowhere to go to and no recourse to the law. But otherwise, it was the matriarch who essentially brought up these children, and it was all them. Like the patriarchs didn't bring up their own children, perhaps. I think it was always the woman's role to bring up children, and so it was just a different kind of upbringing, but upbringing nonetheless.
So do you think, for a student who is new to Goan literature, how do you place this text in Goan literature, and how significant would it be to a new reader?
So I think when we study about Goan literature, one thing I've noticed is that it's always about liberation and migration, as if these are the only two massive things that Goans actually did, and of course we throw in the opinion poll here and there. We really need to come to terms with the fact that our history is extremely shaded, and we need to know that while we may love our Goan culture, there are certain aspects of our culture that were not always as pretty, and we need to start acknowledging that, and the only way we can acknowledge it is by reading about it. So I think our students should 100% be reading about these things. They should know that slavery existed in Goa. They should know these kind of informal practices existed in Goa, and I think it will help them develop a better appreciation for just how far we've come. The fact that we've overcome a practice like this, that it's still not continuing under the guise of culture and tradition. We've not done that, because in a lot of other parts of India, there are a lot of exploitative practices that continue under the guise of culture and tradition and ritual and so on. But this did not continue in Goa, and I think it's something to be proud of. And the only way we can celebrate it is if we talk about these things in our classrooms. So whether the students will receive it well or not, I don't know, but they should at least be told about it.
At least make an attempt.
Yeah.
And be liberal-minded to accept both, the good, the bad, and maybe the ugly.
The ugly.
Yeah, before we wind up to the ultimate question, the penultimate question is, share with us, your study of the literary devices in these texts.
Okay. In terms of literary devices, I think one thing stands out, and again, that's from Wendell Rodricks's novel, Poskem. In order to describe Alda's descent into madness and her new state of mind, he uses magic realism.
Okay.
And you see her talking to birds and to animals because she is now seeking revenge for what this family has done to her. And so she says, oh, the kite is now going to attack them and the snake is going to bite them. And then they talk to her and she talks to them, and that's how she kind of makes sense of what has happened to her. And I think that was the only way Rodrigues could have explained something so cruel in a way that we could digest.
Take it in.
You know, the only way we could take in this this mental state of Alda's mental state is to show just how far gone she actually was. You know, and I think this was, it was fantastic. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. A lot of people didn't like what had happened here. Maybe they didn't understand it, or maybe they just wanted it to be black and white. But if the fact that he's used this kind of technique, you know, to give us that sense of just how hurt and, you know, how hurt she was, I think that was phenomenal.
Lovely. It was nice talking to you, Rochelle,
Yes,
about
likewise.
your thesis. Any further plans for probably postdoctoral or whatever?
Yes, definitely. I definitely want to do a postdoc, and during the course of my study, because I was exploring this slavery angle and things like that, I came across some Indo-Africans, and they're called Siddhis, and I am looking to working with them. I have met them a couple of times. I visited their community, and I think that there is something that I want to do there for sure, in collaboration with them, of course.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean that's essentially where I'm going to
We all wish
go
you
next.
the very best
Thank
in
you
your
so
further
much.
studies and giving us better, you know, books and content for our students of the future. Thank you so much, Rochelle,
Thank you
for being
so
with
much.
us. And bye-bye.
Bye bye.